Japan's high command heard, from the mouths of their best engineers, that a single American factory produced in one day what Japan took a month to try to match, in the middle of World War II. But what kind of technical report, in the midst of the greatest industrial war in history, forces generals to admit in low voices that defeat may begin in the numbers before it appears on the maps? What assembly line is this, in the United States war effort, that keeps running through the night, with well-fed workers, spare parts in surplus, and engines rolling off, almost like mass consumer products? And what happens inside a Japanese command room when this data collides with the reality of bombed factories, lack of fuel, and an exhausted workforce on the Pacific front? In Tokyo, those officers leaf through the document page by page, comparing, in silence, American production from a single day with the effort of an entire month of Japanese industry in World War II, while drawing calculations in the margins of maps. Among underlined numbers and small annotations, a conclusion appeared that was difficult to deny. From that point on, it was not just courage on the front line that decided the fate of the war, but the capacity to keep engines, supplies, and factories running on a scale that Japan simply could not keep up with. If you want to see how this report was written, what exactly the engineers recorded, and what the High Command decided after reading it, leave a like now and subscribe so you do not miss the complete documentary. In Tokyo, during the spring of 1943, a group of senior Japanese naval engineers submitted a classified technical report to the Imperial General Headquarters. The document contained production figures, factory capacity assessments, and comparative analyses of American and Japanese industrial output. It was not written in the language of propaganda or morale-building rhetoric. It was a cold, methodical breakdown of what Japan's most experienced technical officers had observed, calculated, and verified through intelligence sources, prisoner interrogations, and reconnaissance data. The report stated that a single American shipyard could complete the construction of a Liberty-class cargo vessel in approximately 42 days. Some yards had reduced that timeline to less than 2 weeks. Japanese shipyards, working under constant air raids, material shortages, and exhausted labor forces, required an average of 4 to 6 months to build a comparable vessel. The engineers did not editorialize, they simply presented the numbers. But the implications were undeniable. America was building ships faster than Japan could sink them. The report did not stop at shipbuilding. It covered aircraft production, ammunition output, steel manufacturing, and petroleum refining. In every category, the gap was not narrow. It was catastrophic. American factories were producing tens of thousands of aircraft per year, while Japan struggled to maintain production levels in the low thousands. Ammunition plants in the United States operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, with workers rotating in and out of assembly lines that never stopped. Japanese factories, meanwhile, faced rolling blackouts, coal shortages, and a labor force increasingly composed of students, women, and elderly workers pulled from civilian life. Steel output in America had surged to meet wartime demand, with blast furnaces running continuously and scrap metal drives, ensuring a steady supply of raw materials. In Japan, steel production was constrained by limited access to iron ore, reliance on imports that were being systematically cut off by American submarines, and aging infrastructure that could not be modernized under wartime conditions. The engineers who authored the report were not defeatists. They were professionals who understood industrial systems, production timelines, and logistical realities. Many had studied in the United States or Europe before the war. They knew American engineering practices, factory layouts, and the principles of mass production that had been pioneered by companies like Ford and General Motors. They had visited American industrial sites during peacetime and had seen firsthand the scale of operations that could be achieved when capital, labor, and resources were aligned. Now, tasked with assessing Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged war against such an industrial power, they could not ignore the data. One section of the report focused on aircraft engine production. It noted that a single American plant, the Ford Willow Run facility in Michigan, was producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of 1 aircraft per hour at peak capacity. The entire Japanese aviation industry, spread across multiple facilities and struggling with parts shortages, could not match that output in a week. But that was not the most critical part yet. The report also examined the infrastructure that supported American production. It described the rail networks that moved raw materials from mines to factories, the port facilities that handled millions of tons of cargo, and the trucking fleets that distributed finished goods across the country. It analyzed the electrical grid that powered industrial operations without interruption, the food supply systems that kept workers fed and productive, and the housing programs that ensured a stable labor force. The engineers noted that American workers were not just numerous. They were healthy, well-trained, and supported by systems that minimized downtime and maximized efficiency. Japanese workers, by contrast, were increasingly malnourished, overworked, and vulnerable to illness. Factory absenteeism was rising, not because of lack of discipline, but because people were physically unable to sustain the pace required. The logistics of oil were particularly stark. The United States had domestic oil fields in Texas, California, and Oklahoma that produced more petroleum than Japan could ever hope to access. American refineries converted crude oil into aviation fuel, diesel, and lubricants at rates that dwarfed Japanese capacity. Japan, meanwhile, had bet its entire strategy on seizing oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, but those fields were under constant threat from Allied air and naval forces. Transport of oil from Southeast Asia to the home islands required tankers that were being sunk at an unsustainable rate by American submarines. Even when shipments arrived, refining capacity in Japan was limited, and the quality of fuel produced was often inferior to what American forces used. The engineers calculated that without a dramatic reversal in the submarine war, Japan would run out of aviation fuel within 18 months. Without fuel, the remaining aircraft would be grounded, and the war would be over. The report included a section on aluminum production, critical for aircraft manufacturing. The United States had built massive hydroelectric dams to power aluminum smelters, ensuring a steady supply of the lightweight metal needed for airframes. Japan had limited hydroelectric capacity and relied heavily on imported bauxite, which was increasingly difficult to obtain. As a result, Japanese aircraft were often heavier, less efficient, and more expensive to produce than their American counterparts. The engineers noted that this was not a matter of inferior design or lack of skill. Japanese aeronautical engineers were highly competent. The problem was systemic. The industrial base could not support the level of production required to compete. When the report reached the desks of senior officers at Imperial General Headquarters, the reaction was muted. There were no dramatic outbursts, no immediate calls for strategic reversal. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the war had entered a phase where industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance. Some officers argued that Japan's advantage lay in its willingness to fight to the last man, that American forces lacked the resolve for a prolonged conflict, and that time would favor the defender. Others privately admitted that the numbers told a different story. If you want to understand how logistics shaped the Pacific War, leave your comments and turn on notifications for the next documentary. One admiral whose name appears in declassified records, but whose exact words were never made public, reportedly said that Japan had won every battle it needed to win in the first 6 months of the war, but that America had won the war in the factories before the first shot was ever fired. The disparity in production extended to smaller items that are often overlooked in discussions of industrial warfare. The United States produced millions of tires for trucks, jeeps, and aircraft. Japan struggled to produce enough rubber for essential vehicles, Even after capturing rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, American factories churned out spare parts in such quantities that damaged equipment could be repaired or replaced almost immediately. Japanese forces often cannibalized one vehicle to keep another running, a practice that degraded overall operational readiness. Medical supplies, clothing, boots, helmets, and even basic tools were produced in America at scales that ensured every soldier was equipped to standard. Japanese soldiers often fought with outdated or improvised equipment, not because of poor planning, but because the industrial system could not keep pace with demand. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. They were professional military officers who understood that wars were not won by spirit alone. They had studied the campaigns of Napoleon, the American Civil War, and World War I. They knew that logistics determined outcomes. Yet they were caught in a situation where acknowledging the industrial gap meant admitting that the war was unwinnable, while ignoring it meant continuing to send men into battles that could not be sustained. Some chose to focus on tactical innovations, developing new strategies for island defense, kamikaze tactics, and guerrilla warfare. Others quietly began to prepare for the inevitable, knowing that the only question was how long Japan could hold out before collapse. What came next would change everything. By 1944, American production had reached levels that even the pessimistic assessments of 1943 had underestimated. The shipyards that had been producing Liberty ships were now launching escort carriers, destroyers, and fleet auxiliaries at rates that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. American submarine production surged, and the blockade of Japan tightened. Aircraft carriers that had been sunk or damaged in earlier battles were replaced within months. Japanese carriers, once lost, could not be replaced at all. The industrial imbalance that had been a strategic concern in 1943 became an operational catastrophe by 1945. Japanese engineers continued to submit reports, each one more dire than the last. They documented the collapse of rail networks under American bombing, the failure of steel mills due to lack of coal, and the shutdown of aircraft factories because aluminum supplies had run out. They described workers who could no longer meet production quotas because they were starving factories that operated at a fraction of capacity, because electrical grids had been damaged and ports that could no longer handle cargo because cranes and docks had been destroyed. The reports were read, filed, and largely ignored, not because the information was inaccurate, but because there was nothing that could be done to reverse the trends they described. By the summer of 1945, the Industrial War was over. Japan's factories were silent, its oil reserves depleted, and its transportation network shattered. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the final punctuation on a sentence that had been written in steel, aluminum, and petroleum years earlier. The engineers who had warned of this outcome in 1943 were proven correct, but there was no satisfaction in being right. They had watched their country fight with courage and determination, only to be overwhelmed by an enemy whose factories never stopped, whose workers never went hungry, and whose supply lines stretched across the Pacific without breaking. The lesson was not lost on post-war analysts. Japan had entered the war with a highly trained military, experienced officers, and initial tactical advantages. It lost because it could not sustain industrial production on the scale required for modern warfare. The United States, with its vast natural resources, advanced infrastructure, and coordinated industrial mobilization, had built a war machine that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. The engineers who wrote those reports understood this before most generals did. They saw the truth in the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. Comment where you are watching from and share this video with anyone who wants to understand how industrial power shaped World War II. Thank you for watching Deep History.